Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Poketown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be looking at the top 8 breakdown of the Sacramento Regional Championships. This is a 1,400 player tournament, and it was a Lugia deck not only coming out in first place, but also sort of having its redemption arc after having a pretty poor conversion rate in Peoria. Now we see 4 of them filling our top 8 placements. So the colourless build has finally put itself on the map and is proving itself to be a top contender. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the deck lists themselves, let's familiarise ourselves with the Day 1 and Day 2 fields. It looked like the 3 most popular archetypes were Lost Zone Box, Charizard EX with Pidgeot more often than not, and Miraidon actually quite popular with 13%. This is a bit surprising. It did of course do well in Peoria, but it still feels like it's one of the less safe decks to play in the game because of Lost Box being such a high profile archetype that it's quite an awkward matchup for the Miraidon players. But outside of Lost Box and maybe Mew, I think Miraidon still is that sort of decent pace setter. At least it's very consistent. You get to play 3 games. So it's not overly surprising that it's at that 3rd place, really. But I would expect this to be changing going into possibly Lille this weekend, where I would imagine after this weekend's results, maybe some more Lugia, where at the moment it's in that 6th position with just 8%, after being much more popular in Peoria. I would imagine Lugia recovers some ground, and I still think there probably will be a struggle between the single strike build and the colourless build, because of course if Lugia does well, then people have more incentive to play Miraidon and other builds which are good into the colourless list of Lugia. So single strike is kind of better against Miraidon at the very least, and is kind of better against a handful of other matchups. So I would expect there to be possibly a small uptick in Lugia, maybe still not making that top 3, but probably over 10% going into the next tournament. Gardevoir still holding steady with that 12 or so percent. I think that's pretty reasonable right now. Gembao, Baxcalibur had a fairly decent showing in Peoria, of course, once again, and I think more people are just getting climatized to that deck list and are accepting that it's kind of just a well-known 60 now that's been well ironed out by some very high-level players, and piloting it to decent success, knowing that it can prey on certainly the stage 2 decks of metagame. And there isn't a huge amount of path around right now. Looking at our top 6, it's really only the Miraidon players that are using those Path of the Peaks in high counts. Possibly the DTE-based builds of Mew are also going to try and judge path spam, but currently it's sat outside the sort of top 6 decks, and a big reason for that is, of course, that Charizard EX. It did very well in Peoria, it converted very well into Day 2, didn't make any top 8 placements, and once again this weekend it also failed to convert into top 8, but it seems to still be popular. And as we move into the Day 2 analysis, it's sort of holding that ground. I think Lost Zone Box really did exceptionally well, and Miraidon seemed to suffer, unsurprisingly really, because it was popular, but Lost Zone Box was rising to the top and basically farming the Miraidons, I would say, more or less. Lugia maintained its 8%, which is pretty good, but then also did extremely well in Day 2. For just 11 Lugias to then have 4 finally make it into top 8 shows that it has the legs to go deep into tournaments. Basically, Charizard, Guardy, Chien-Pao, Miraidon, they all sort of, well, sorry, everything but Miraidon held strong. Miraidon had a bit of a rough time, really. There wasn't enough Lugias to feast on, sort of on that side of the seesaw, and there was too many Lost Boxes, probably pushing it down a little bit, so it just seemed to have hit slightly the wrong metagame overall for it. But for once, we don't see anything sort of being yeeted out of the top 6 and something sneaking in. Sometimes you see, like, what was actually the play was probably piloted by sub 8% of people in the Day 1 field. We've seen that at times where Mew was snuck into the graphic, or another deck here or there, like sometimes even Rapid Strike sneaks into the graphic, where it is evident that those who chose to play that archetype were getting rewarded and were having really good conversion into that Day 2. So it seems like we're getting more stabilized around the 6 decks in front of you, as these are probably all vying for contention as the best decks in the room. I probably would throw Mew into that bracket as well, especially because Charizard still hasn't top 8'd. I feel like the percentages that we've seen in the last 2 tournaments could be slightly like just reducing down. Maybe not falling off like completely, not being a sub 8% deck probably, but I wouldn't be super surprised if it started to go around that sort of 10% mark, similar to the Chen Pows and stuff like that. So just some small tweaks. I still expect, even with Lost Box having insanely good day 1 to 2 conversion, I think that was really because Lugia kind of flopped Peoria, so the runway was kind of clear for Lost Box, and Miraidon hype from Peoria also inflated that percentage for the day 1 field. And I feel like that meant that the metagame was very, very strong for Lost Zone Box. I feel like because Lost Box did very well from day 1 to day 2 in this tournament, and because Lugia is on the radar, there are headaches for Lost Zone because it is very rough. Even the Kyogre build, I was trying some of that this week, testing against Jack, and that matchup is, man, it's hard. Like, even with Kyogre, the Lugia matchup is not easy, and it feels like one of the biggest mainstream checks to the Lost Zone Box deck is Lugia. So not only did it perform well, giving players confidence to pilot Lugia, it kind of just makes sense if you expect Lost Zone to still be the most popular deck in the room to play Lugia, because then you're just checking the best deck in the game in Lost Box, which is, you know, it's already taken 2 regionals, so I think it's not unfair to call Lost Box the best deck right now. So jumping into the top 8 then, this is what the breakdown was for Lugias out of the top 8. Like I said, really, really doing well. At the start of day 2, there was a ton of Lost Box, all in that sort of top 16 chunk with those really high records after the day 1. But the Lugias kept finding them and catching them and pushing them down. Azul and Sawyer were still able to make it with those Kyogre builds, and we'll have a look at those deck lists in a moment. But overall, Colorless Lugia had an exceptional showing, and we also had a Arc Gyarados, which we're certainly going to be looking at, and a Gardevoir EX filling out that top 8. So unfortunately, we're yet to have a couple of the Lugia deck lists, but fortunately there are so many of them that we still will be able to take a look at a couple of them. Charlie Kerr made top 8, and I think also made top 16 at Peoria with Colorless Lugia, so is definitely accustomed to playing the archetype. Interestingly, choosing to play a 3-3 counter the Lugia and actually just bumping up to a 3rd copy of Nest Ball, so possibly you just lead other Pokemon that little bit more. Having higher odds of leading Snorlax is pretty good for you whenever you're going second. Also, you have a Mew EX in the deck, so that's also a pretty reasonable lead for you, which is okay. Outside of that, it's pretty streamlined, choosing to go with Radiant Zard plus Luminous over Lux Reversal or just pure colorless energies. I feel like Radiant Charizard's good enough into the likes of Chien-Pao, into the likes of Miraidon actually, where you can give yourself that fighting chance by trying to offset your prize race by forcing your opponent through that Zard. So it seems like it's worthwhile to me, and it seems like Charlie's going with that approach. Interestingly, not playing Pumpkaboo, and I think that is still a question mark and a risk to not play the card, because I think there is still enough path to be worried about. Like, Miraidon was the 3rd most popular deck, at least in this tournament, and there is still murmurings of DTE base builds of Mew, so I would like to still play the Pump in the list personally, but I do understand that, like, Mesagoza and Collapsed have good, like, just secondary effects outside of just being a bounce, and the Pump is an annoying lead for you and such, so I understand the reasons to not play the Pump, but I still want to respect path personally myself. Dominic was the other top 8 deck list, and also some really interesting choices here. So we've just seen a 3-3 line of Lugia. Well, how about a 5-3 line, because you have the Transformative Start Ditto in this deck list. It's got the quad jet energy, so in theory you can yeet your Ditto into the active position that little bit more often and try and get your ideal lead, whether it is that Snorlax or a Lugia. And in some instances, you may just prefer it to be a single prize Pokemon sat in your active position, and you have enough search that you find Lugia anyway and feel okay with it, and force your opponent to find boss on turn 2 or whatever. So actually a pretty okay card. We've seen this online in a number of Lugia deck lists, and Ditto is proving itself to be a fairly versatile, okay card, I say, with gritted teeth. Interestingly, Dominic is choosing to play both Charizard and Luxray. You don't always see the combination of the two, but giving you power spikes in different situations, especially with so much Lugia around, players may be looking to have the Luxray in their deck list to give themselves a mirror edge going into the next set of tournaments. So that's another really important thing to sort of keep track of and think about if you're looking to pilot Lugia yourself coming into the next few events, whether or not the Luxray package could give you that mirror edge. Onto the Lost Boxes. Azul, one of the best Lost Zone players and just one of the best players in the world over the last few years, just ruthlessly consistent, gets themselves another top 8 placement. Following on from last week's success with the Zamazenta build of Kyogre Lost Zone Box, trying to represent pretty much just one prize board state throughout the entire game, giving yourself more breathing room to work in that Aqua Storm combo in a number of matchups, and giving yourself a powerful beat stick in the Zamazenta, being able to reach that 220 threshold, which is a really good number for dealing with Evolving V Pokemon, or just a follow-up play from a Spit Innocently, or even from Lost Mind damage. It just seems to be a very efficient attacking option. I believe it's just one card change from the successful Peoria list, and that is going to be Escape Rope coming into that 4th copy in favour of that Beach Court, knowing that you really do like to pay retreats a lot with this deck, just to bank energy in the bin. So I actually do like this very minute change from the previous week. But the tug of war continues, because Sawyer did also pilot Kyogre, but it's the more turbo-esque approach where you have the extra copy of the Forest Seal Stone, and you have some actual V attackers, and the Lost Vacuum in here as well. So it's still horses for courses. Do you like having the option to have your burst potential plays with Dragonite and with Raikou to play that tempo game in matchups where the Aqua Storm is less powerful, or just to give yourself win conditions earlier on in the game without having it to go down to the nitty-gritty moments? So it really is going to be down to the player's playstyle, I think, really, if you really want to grind things out and get that Aqua Storm on turn like 6 of the game, or if you want to have win conditions where you just ramp to 7 in slightly high roll situations, admittedly, but it's not losing too many percentage points compared to just regular turbo. It's like one less forest, one less vacuum, essentially. But oftentimes you will forest for the vacuum if that's required, and if you've already found chorus, for example. So I don't think you're losing massive percentage points and have the opportunity to just steal games away from people because you were able to burst that Dragonite or that Greninja early on, and that's also a very viable strategy. Ryan was doing well with the Gardevoir archetype. Not too much surprising going on in the deck list. Choosing to play the Spiritomb tech card, I think that was something of a knee-jerk reaction for Sacramento. I know Mew wasn't all that popular, but I think the narrative really was that, firstly, Charizard performed well and was very popular, but also because the top 8 placement from Rowan with Mew made people kind of on high alert of the archetype, and Mew's always going to have to be on that bell curve of finding the right tournament to pick when people aren't respecting it quite enough. And it seemed like for Sacramento, everyone was ready with their pitchforks in the form of Spiritombs and in the form of Drapions, or just playing Charizard altogether. Sometimes I was even hearing Charizard was playing Spiritomb as well, which is insane to me. But yeah, I think people were very prepared for the Mew overall, and it seems like Ryan was among those people. But also Spiritomb gives you bonus percentages into Lugia, because sometimes you just make them brick by not having fish access. And the same can be said for actually the Charizard matchup, where you can deny the opponents from putting their Pidgeot back into the deck, which is fun, but also you can prevent Luminion from fishing out the Arven, so you really hurt their outs to just get the turn 2, double EX pop off sort of thing. Outside of that, just sticking with the double collapse stadium, something we've seen previously from Brent, and also just going with the high ball search counts and the high support accounts rather than the pal pad and the other responsive recovery cards, just trying to have really high counts of everything you need to get into the game, and it seems to be a pretty good policy overall. Finally then, we've saved the best till last. Nicolo really winning some people over with the Arceus Gyarados Bibarel slacking thing that you see in front of you. I think there's a lot of really interesting concepts coming in here, and I have listened to Nicolo's interviews where the cornerstones of Judge Path are still very much a key element to Arceus' success. That shouldn't be too much of a surprise to you here. Interesting that it's incorporated the Radiant Greninja for some extra draw power throughout the game, in addition to the Bibarel, which I think is very cool. It also might bait people into putting Manaphy down against Nicolo as well, because we have seen Arc builds with Pidgeot in the past play the Penny supporter, and I think that could even be tapped into this deck list potentially, seeing as though it wasn't in Nicolo's list. People may not be playing around it, so then you can play the Penny and actually use the Greninja. You can see the gymnastics I'm working through here. In terms of logic, but just seeing the Greninja in an Arc deck, people may have already set that precedent in their heads and have to put down a Manaphy against you, which I think is actually pretty important, that you can deny a bench space from a number of decks. But also, giving yourself Water Energy gives you access to Melanie, so you are allowed to miss turn 1 attachment and still reach a turn 2 attack if you can Starbirth towards, Water Energy plus discard synergy cards, plus the Melanie, and then whatever. So you can find ways of doing it, which I think is pretty interesting. At the same time, we are seeing the 1-1 line of the Gyarados. We've actually seen this previously. I think it was like a year ago where we saw this sort of Arc Gyarados deck. Back then, it was playing Memory Capsule and like Jolteon for disruption of like Inteleon. So we are going back pre-rotation, actually. But the raw stats on Gyarados V are fairly impressive. Get Angry is an annoying attack if people are forced to hit into it. And we do have that VMAX, which hits a vanilla 240, which isn't a bad number, similar to how we've just seen Dura be good for being a 3-prize mon that can just push through 2 prizes at times. And the Hyper Beam, you know, it's some setup damage with some disruption in there as well. So if you are doing this sort of Judge Iono path spam, sometimes the extra energy drop can be awkward for the opponent as well. The Lightning weakness is sketchy, especially with so much Miraidon around right now, so I don't know how optimal the Gyarados is, but in many matchups this will be like a pure Arceus deck anyway, and we have the slacking backup for the heavy impact option. Its kind of lazy ability does suck, but you do play 4 paths to lock it out, so you are just hitting that 260 vanilla for full energy. There's V-Guard to make the slacking tankier. We have the Defiance Band and the Choice Belt. I actually think Defiance Band is really intelligent in the deck list for pushing Arc into range onto even EX Pokemon. So when you are up against the Miraidon players, when you are up against the Chien-Paos, you have a more responsive play. The Vengeful Punch, also an annoying card. I've liked it in previous Arc builds as well. Obviously a tech card for Guardy to make life more difficult for them. You are making them gust around, like your Arc or your Gyarados or something like that, so that they're not double downing themselves, similar to a Box of Disaster play. So yeah, seems like a pretty interesting deck list. I think Sharon's Kerr, plus all this Judge Shenanigan path stuff, is really annoying for the Lost Zone players, and I do think that Arc Piles could once again be sneaking into the metagame. We also have the ninth place list, which was an Arc Dura as well. Just a quick flash of that. I'm not going to go into this deck list in too much detail, but just more reinforcement that Arc has a place in this game, because there is enough Lost Box going around that having this annoying, chunky 2-prize army in front of you with potential healing plays and denial plays available with hand disruption all over the shop, it's just annoying. It's just hard for the Lost Box players to get through this, especially with Judge disrupting Kyogre combinations so frequently that the game can kind of just trickle away from them. The Sands of Time really just are put on the Kyogre players, and just spamming this disruption is really frustrating for them, where they are so reliant on getting all the way to the bottom of their deck to get anything done. So overall, there are some cards that you may question, but it seems like it's a really correct blend right now, especially for day 2. You can see how Nicolo did so well was because there was just so much Lost Box rising to the top tables that I'm sure that they would have played a few of them on their routes towards the final. So yeah, really interesting deck list. I do think Arc Piles are probably kind of back on that radar. They're basically being kept in check by Miraidon, I want to say, more than anything else. And possibly if there are still like single strike builds of Lugia, that's quite bad for Arc. But Arc much prefers seeing colorless builds of Lugia, there's no doubt about that. And whenever you go first, you have like Judge Path shenanigans before they get to V-Star. So you do have a decent amount of win conditions in the format. Chien-Pao hates Judge Path, obviously. So I feel like it's certainly a viable strategy. That's part of the reason why Miraidon's got far in the last few tournaments, is that it has that combination of cards available, because it's annoying for both Stage 2 decks. Chien-Pao's a combo deck, Lost Box is in many ways a combo deck, especially if it's Kyogre based, which seems to be the most popular build right now. So yeah, just playing Judge is good in the game right now, and Nicolo really identified a good tournament for that to be the case. So I'm super interested in how Arc Piles adjust, whether we are going to see a return to sort of type coverage mons, if we start seeing the Umbreons come back, if we start seeing the Duras sneak back as well, because there's a lot of colorless going around. It's going to have a profound impact on the metagame as we start to see Arcs probably still remain sub, like, or around that sort of 5 to 8% threshold in terms of day 1 play. But I do think it could muscle its way in and become, once again, a deck in the format, because as we've seen with so many tournaments since rotation, that just Starbirth gets over the line in so many occasions that you just get into games and you say that, you know, you put your opponent in a situation where they have to also be in the game, even from low hand sizes, and they can't always do that. And sometimes you just need to turn with the Arc to just have a really advantageous board position or prize map. So yeah, let me know your thoughts of the top 8 down below. Is it going to be colorless Lugia supremacy at Lille? Are they going to keep the Lost Boxes in check? Is it putting you off playing Lost Box, or are you still happy to pilot the deck? Because ultimately it did so well from its day 1 to 2 conversion, and there was still another couple in that top 8. Is it time to start seeing Arceus pop up again? And what are your main thoughts? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow for another video. Cheers.